The town of Ember Creek had decided the matter of Wren Ashby a long time before Wren Ashby was ever asked her opinion of it, and the matter they had decided was this, that a blind girl was a thing to be pitied and provided for and, above all, married off quietly to whoever could be got to take her, for no man in his right mind would choose such a burden, and the sooner some arrangement was reached the better for everyone concerned, by which the town meant the better for everyone except Wren, whose concerning was never much considered. She was 21 years old that winter. She had been blind since a fever took her sight at the age of 5. 16 years of darkness she had long since stopped thinking of as darkness at all, for she had built herself a whole world out of the other 4 senses and lived in it as fully as any sighted soul, though no one in Ember Creek would ever have credited it. She knew her uncle's house by heart, every board and doorway and stair, and moved through it with a sure grace that unsettled strangers. She could card and spin and knead and bake, could tell an egg's freshness by its weight, and a storm's coming by the smell of the air, and a person's mood by the sound of their step on the porch. She could sing, too, Lord. She could sing, a high, clear, aching voice that could stop work in the fields, and she had a memory like a steel trap for every kindness and every cruelty ever done her. But the town saw none of that. The town saw the soft, unfocused eyes that did not quite meet your own, and it stopped seeing anything else, exactly the way a town does. There was a thing Wren did on the hardest days, when Hester's tongue had been sharpest or the town's pity had pressed too close, and it was the only extravagance her narrow life allowed her. She would slip out past the woodshed to the old stone wall at the edge of the pasture, where no one troubled to follow a blind girl, and she would sing. She had a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her small frame, high and clear and full of a longing she never let show any other way, and she sang the old songs her mother had sung her before the fever, and the hymns and wordless airs of her own making, and it was the one place in the whole world Wren Ashby felt entirely herself, unpitied, unjudged, unblind. For a voice needs no eyes, and in her singing she was no one's burden but simply, wholly, a woman making something beautiful out of the dark she'd been given. Hester thought it foolishness and said so. Caterwauling by the wall again, she would sniff as though we hadn't work enough. But Wren noticed that the hired men stopped their chores to listen, and that once, only once, she'd heard her gruff, indifferent uncle standing in the barn door through the whole of a song saying nothing, and had understood that even a hard house could not quite shut out a thing that beautiful. She kept the singing for herself. It was the truest thing she owned, and she'd learned young that a town which pities you will also, if you let it. Take even your gifts and turn them into more cause for pity, however does she manage, poor thing, and so she guarded her music close, and sang only where the pitying could not reach. She lived with her uncle and his wife, having been orphaned young, and if her uncle was merely indifferent, his wife Hester was something colder. Hester Ashby had taken in her husband's blind niece as a Christian duty grudgingly performed, and had spent a dozen years making sure Wren understood the size of the debt she owed for being fed and housed despite her uselessness, though Wren was far from useless, and did the work of 2 women about that house, which Hester accepted as her due and called when she mentioned it at all, earning her keep. And Hester wanted Wren gone. A blind spinster niece was an expense and an embarrassment and a fixture that would not leave of its own accord, and so Hester had set herself that winter to the business of getting the girl married, and had found, after considerable effort, a man willing to consider it, Mr. Clarence Fisk, who kept the dry goods store, a soft, fussy widower of 45 with small, pale eyes and a weak chin, who was not moved by love, God knew, but by the small inheritance Wren's dead father had left in trust, a sum that would come to her husband on the wedding day, and which Clarence Fisk wanted a good deal more than he wanted the girl attached to it. The whole sorry arrangement came to its head on a gray Sunday after church in the churchyard with half of Ember Creek looking on, and it was as public a humiliation as the town had witnessed in years. For Clarence Fisk, it seemed, had agreed to the match on Hester's description of it without ever quite grasping, or letting himself grasp, the full particulars, and now, confronted with his intended bride in the flesh, confronted with the way her lovely unfocused eyes did not track him, the way her hand came out to find the churchyard gate, some fastidious cowardice in him rebelled, and he chose of all the moments to draw his line, that public one. "Now see here, Mrs. Ashby," he said, loud enough for the lingering congregation to hear, drawing back from Wren as though her blindness were catching, "I'll not be made a fool of. You led me to understand the girl was merely delicate, nobody said stone blind. A man can't have a blind wife, it's not to be thought of. She can't keep proper house, can't read his ledgers, can't so much as see to sew a straight seam. Why, she'd be a millstone round my neck till the day I died. No man would wed a blind girl, madam, not for twice the money, and you'd no business trying to pass her off on a respectable widower. I'll thank you both to consider the whole thing forgotten." And he settled his bowler and stalked off across the trodden snow, and the churchyard filled with the particular soft murmur of a crowd that has just watched something cruel and is enjoying it while pretending to be shocked. And Wren Ashby stood by the churchyard gate with her hand resting on the cold iron, and her chin held level, and every eye in Ember Creek on her scarred pride. And she did not weep, though she wanted to, and she did not flee, though she wanted that more, for she had learned long ago that to a town that has decided you are helpless, the smallest dignity is the only weapon you have, and she would not give them the satisfaction. She only said, in her clear, quiet voice, pitched to carry just as far as Fisk's had, "I can sew a straighter seam than any woman in this churchyard, Mr. Fisk, blind or no, and I could keep house for you with my eyes shut, which, as you've noticed, is the only way I've got. But you needn't trouble yourself. I'd not wed a man who wanted my father's money and called it taking me off the shelf. Good day to you." And she turned, and she found the path by memory, and she walked home alone through the snow with her back straight, and not one soul in that whole watching town came to walk beside her, and she thought, walking, that she had known for a long time she would grow old, unwed, and unwanted, and that it was a foolish weakness to have let even a mean coward like Fisk stir up a hope she'd thought she'd killed, and she resolved again to kill it for good this time. Hope was the one thing in Wren Ashby's dark world that could still make her stumble. She did not know that a man had watched the whole thing from the edge of the churchyard, standing quiet by his sledge with a jar of honey he'd meant to leave for the parson, and that the sight of it had made his big hands close into fists. Micah Barlow was not from Ember Creek proper, but from a homestead an hour up the valley on Honey Ridge, where he kept bees and a few cattle and lived alone and quiet, coming to town but seldom. He was near 40, a solid, warm-eyed man, with a neat brown beard and a calm that most folk mistook for simplicity until they had reason to learn better. And Micah Barlow had stood in that churchyard and listened to a soft fool of a shopkeeper declare that no man would wed a blind girl, and had watched the blind girl herself answer with more grace and grit than the whole rest of the town possessed between them, and something in Micah had gone very still and certain, the way it did when he knew a thing all the way through. For Micah Barlow had been raised by a blind woman. His own mother had lost her sight to the same kind of fever when Micah was a baby, and had raised 3 sons and kept a good home and been in Micah's sure memory the wisest and most capable and most beloved soul he had ever known, blind every day of it, and the notion that blindness made a woman a burden or a millstone, or a thing no man would want, struck Micah Barlow not as sad but as simply stupidly false, an idea only a fool who'd never known a blind woman could hold. He had loved his mother past telling. He had buried her 3 years back and missed her every day, and watching Wren Ashby walk out of that churchyard alone with her chin up, Micah felt something he had not felt since his mother died, which was the sense of being in the presence of that same rare quality, the deep grace of a soul that has learned to live fully in the dark. And he made up his mind about Wren Ashby right there in the snow, as thoroughly as he had ever made up his mind about anything. He did not rush it. He was not a rushing man. He found reasons to come down the valley that winter, honey for the mercantile, a mended harness, a Sunday service he'd not attended in a year, and he found ways to fall into Wren's company that did not frighten or crowd her. He learned that she came to the creek most mornings to draw water, finding her way by a rope her uncle had strung, and he took to being there, and they talked, first of small things and then of large ones. And Wren, who could not see his face and so had learned to read people truer than the sighted did, by the timbre of the voice and the rhythm of the breath and the thousand tells a body gives that the eyes distract you from noticing, found that she could not catch this quiet man in a single false note. He did not pity her. She knew pity's sound better than any music, the careful, softened, condescending tone folk used, and Micah Barlow never once used it. He spoke to her plainly, as an equal, teased her even, argued with her about Scripture and the best cure for a cough and whether a person could truly know a color they'd never seen, and he listened to her sing once, when she did not know he was near, and did not speak of it after except to say, gruff, that he'd not heard anything so fine since his mother passed, and his mother had had the best voice in the county. Your mother, Wren said, for she had caught the thing he'd let slip. You've spoken of her before. She sang. She did, Micah said. Blind as you from a fever, when I was small, raised the 3 of us alone after our father drowned. Ran the whole place. Never met her equal, sighted nor otherwise, and I've met a good many folk. He was quiet a moment. So you'll understand, Wren Ashby, that when I heard that fool in the churchyard say no man would wed a blind girl, it was all I could do not to laugh in his face, for the finest woman I ever knew was a blind girl once, and any man would have been blessed past deserving to have her. And the only blind ones in that yard were the folk standing round with working eyes and no wit to use them. And Wren stood very still by the winter creek with the rope in her hand, and felt the hope she had tried so hard to kill stir and lift its head, and for once she did not have the heart to strike it down. There was a morning at the creek that Wren kept ever after folded in her memory. A hard frost had glazed everything in the night, and she had come down the rope line for water as always, and the world was treacherous with ice she could not see but could hear, that thin, dangerous ring underfoot, and she had stood a moment at the creek's edge gathering her nerve for the slick walk back with the full pail. And Micah, who was there, Micah always seemed, that winter, to be there, did not rush to take the pail from her, nor cluck over her, nor do any of the smothering, helpful things that told a blind woman she was thought incapable. He only said, easy, there's a bad patch of glaze about 4 steps ahead of you and another by the big flat stone. The rest's just crusted snow, safe enough. You want my arm, it's here, but you don't need it. And Wren had stood very still, for no sighted person had ever in her life done that, had never simply given her the information and let her decide, the way you would for anyone, instead of seizing her elbow and steering her like a wheelbarrow. "You didn't grab me," she said, wondering. "No," said Micah. "My mother broke a wooden spoon over my brother's knuckles once for grabbing at her. I've got no eyes, not no wits," she'd say. "Tell me what's there and let me walk my own road." I reckon it's the truest thing she ever taught me. And Wren had taken his arm then, not because she needed it, but because she wanted to, which was a different thing entirely, and both of them knew it. And they had walked back up the icy path together, talking of his mother, and the pail had not spilled a drop. He brought her things, that winter, small things, chosen with a care that undid her. Not ribbons and fripperies a blind girl couldn't see, the way well-meaning fools brought, but things for her hands and her ears and her clever nose, a bar of fine milled soap scented with real lavender, a bird whistle carved from applewood that made a call so true the chickadees answered it, a little music box, once, wound to play a tune, which she held to her ear with her eyes shut and her face gone soft as a child's. "You give me things I can have," she said, turning the music box in her fingers. "Do you know you're the first? Everyone else gives me things to look at, and then feels bad when I can't, and then I've got to comfort them for my own blindness. You never once made me do that. Seems a poor sort of gift," Micah said, "that makes the getter do the comforting." And Wren had laughed, but her throat was tight, for it was a small thing and it was everything, and she was beginning to understand, with a mixture of joy and terror, that she had gone and fallen in love with a beekeeper from Honey Ridge, and did not in the least know how to stop. The proposal, when it came in the same public churchyard where she'd been shamed, and Micah Barlow did that on purpose, for he was a gentle man but not a soft one, and he had a thing he wanted the town of Ember Creek to hear. He came down on a Sunday in the deep of winter and waited till the service let out and the congregation gathered in the snowy yard, Esther Ashby among them and Clarence Fisk too, and he walked up to Wren before all of them and took off his hat and said, in his calm, carrying voice, "Wren Ashby, I've come to ask you something, and I've a mind to ask it here, where they all shamed you so they can hear it asked honest." The churchyard went silent. "There's folk in this town said no man would wed a blind girl. Said you were a burden and a millstone and a thing to be got rid of quiet. I've come to tell them and you that they're fools, every one, and they've been fools about the best thing that ever came among them." He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't need a wife with eyes, Wren. I've got 2 good ones of my own, and they've never once shown me anything half so worth seeing as the way you carry yourself, nor told me anything half so true as what you hear with none. I don't need eyes. I need her heart, your heart, for it's the finest one in this valley, and I've known it since I watched you walk out of this yard alone with your head high. Marry me. Come up to Honey Ridge and be my wife, and let this whole blind town watch a man who can see plain do the thing not one of them had the sense to do. Marry me, Wren Ashby, not to spite your dark, just as you are whole and enough and wanted more than I've wanted anything since I was a boy at my mother's knee." The churchyard did not make a sound, and Wren Ashby stood in the snow with the whole town holding its breath, and she turned her face up toward the voice of the man she could not see, and had come, these winter weeks, to know better than she'd ever known anyone, and she found her own voice was not quite steady. "Micah Barlow," she said, "you're asking me in front of every soul who ever pitied me, and I know why, and I love you for it. Though I'll deny I said so if you tell them." A ripple of startled laughter through the yard. "You could have any seeing woman in this valley. Are you certain, truly certain, it's not a kind heart's charity? For I couldn't bear that. I'd sooner stay a spinster the rest of my life than be some good man's good deed." "Wren," Micah said, and she heard him step close. Heard him with that whole body listening she'd built her life on, and felt him take her 2 hands in his warm ones. "Put your hands on my face. Go on. You read folk truer than eyes ever did, you've told me so. Read mine now and tell me if you find charity in it, or a lie of any kind, and if you do I'll walk away and never trouble you." And Wren Ashby raised her hands, there in the snowy churchyard before the whole staring town, and laid her fingertips against Micah Barlow's bearded face, and read it the way she read everything, and she found beneath her fingers a man smiling, and no lie in him anywhere, only a warm, steady, certain wanting. And her own face crumpled and bloomed at once. "There's no charity here," she whispered, wondering. "There's no charity in you at all. You truly want me." "I truly do," said Micah. "Then yes," said Wren Ashby, blind and beloved in the snow, "oh yes." And the town of Ember Creek watched Micah Barlow gather the girl they'd thrown away into his arms, and Hester Ashby's pinched face went white, and Clarence Fisk found something interesting to look at on his shoes, and somewhere a woman in the crowd began, despite herself, to weep. They were married within the month, and Wren went up the valley to Honey Ridge, and Micah's snowbound farm became, under her hands, a home. She learned it the way she learned everything, by touch and step and patient memory, and within a season she moved through the farmhouse and the yard and the honey shed as surely as she'd moved through her uncle's house. And Micah watched her do it with a quiet pride that never wore off. He gave her a dog, a great gentle golden farm dog named Nell, and Nell took to Wren as though she'd been bred for it, walking at her left hand across the snowy yard, warning her of the ice and the low branch and the barn cat underfoot, sleeping across her feet at night. And between the dog and her own sure senses, Wren was freer on that mountain than she had ever been in the town that had thought her helpless. She was happy. She was happier than she had known a person could be. And she waited, in the small guarded back of her heart, for it to be revealed as too good to be true, for that was the one shadow her sunny nature had never quite thrown off. The old cold certainty, planted deep by a lifetime of being called a burden, that she was too much trouble to be truly wanted, and that Micah's love, however real it felt, must someday tire and turn to duty. The bees were her particular delight once the spring came round and Micah opened the hives, though that first winter she knew them only by the low sleeping hum of the wintering skeps in the shed. Micah taught her the bees as his blind mother had taught him, by sound and scent and the gentle laying on of hands, and Wren proved a natural, calm and unhurried among them where sighted folk flinched and flailed. For she had no eyes to be startled by the swirl of them, and worked instead by the changing note of their humming, which told her, she said, everything, whether they were content or fretful, queen-right or troubled, and Micah swore his bees gave more honey the year Wren came than they ever had, and that it was her singing did it, for she sang to them at their work. And in the evenings there was the deep contentment of a warm house shared, the fire and the good supper and Micah reading aloud to her, for she loved to be read to, and he had a low, easy reading voice, and the great dog Nell asleep across both their feet, and it was, Wren thought, more happiness than she had ever dared to name in all her guarded life, which was exactly why she could not quite trust it. She would catch herself in the middle of some ordinary joy, bracing, waiting for the turn, for the day Micah's patience would fray, for the moment she'd become the burden she'd always been told she was. She never spoke of it. But Micah, who read her as truly as she read him, knew it was there, that old buried splinter. and grieved that he could not simply pull it out, and understood that some things a person has to be shown and cannot merely be told. Micah felt it in her, the waiting, the flinch, and he set himself to loving it out of her slow and patient, the way he'd have gentled a frightened horse, and it might have taken years, save that the mountain gave her, one black winter night, the chance to lay it to rest forever. The fire started in the night in the barn from a lantern a hired man had left, and it was Wren who woke first. Wren, who smelled the smoke long before it thickened, whose dark sharpened senses caught the wrongness while Micah and the hired man still slept, and Wren, who shook her husband awake with the alarm. And then the fire came into the house faster than seemed possible, and the smoke came with it, thick and black and blinding, and here was the thing, the terrible, wonderful thing. In that choking dark, the sighted men were struck helpless. Micah, who knew his own house like his own hand, was lost the instant the smoke put out his eyes and stole his air, blundering and coughing, disoriented. No more able to find the door in that black smother than a newborn. But Wren was not lost. Wren had never once in 16 years needed her eyes to find a door. The smoke that blinded Micah was nothing to a woman who had lived her whole life in the dark, and the roar and crackle that disoriented him only sharpened her, and Wren Ashby took her coughing, helpless husband by the hand firm as iron, and she said, "Micah, stop, be still, and hold to me and do exactly as I say, for this is my country now, not yours. Down low, follow me. I know the way in the dark. I always have." And she led him, led the strong-sighted man who had rescued her, led him on her hands and knees through the blinding smoke by memory and touch and the sure map in her head, past the fallen beam he could not see, around the wall of flame to the door and out into the blessed cold snow, and then, when Micah gasped that the hired man was still inside, she did not hesitate. She wet a cloth and tied it over her face, and she went back into the black, roaring house that no seeing person could enter, back into the dark that was her element and her whole life's practice, and she found the overcome man by the sound of his coughing, and she dragged him out too, out into the snow, and she saved all three of their lives that night, the blind girl no man would wed, in a darkness that made her the only one of them who could see. They stood in the snow, the three of them, singed and gasping and alive, and watched the barn burn down, and the house saved by the neighbors who came at last with the alarm. And Micah Barlow held his wife against him and could not speak for a long while, and when he could, his voice shook. "You saved us," he said, "all three, in the dark. I was helpless as a babe, and you," he broke off. "Wren, every soul in that valley called you a burden, a millstone, a thing that couldn't keep house nor see to a chore. And tonight the dark came, and you were the only one of us with eyes. The only one." He took her sooty face in his hands. "I married you because I loved you and knew your worth. But I want you to hear this, and I want you never to doubt it again as long as you live. You are not the weak one in this house. You never were. There's not a sighted soul in this county I'd sooner have at my side in the dark than you, for you've spent your whole life learning the very thing the rest of us only just found out we don't know. How to see with something better than eyes. Burden. God above. You're the strongest of us, Wren Barlow. You always were, and it took a fire to show this fool valley what I knew the day I met you." And Wren Ashby, Wren Barlow now, stood in the snow with her husband's hands framing her face and felt the last of the old cold certainty, the burden she had carried longer than her blindness, the belief that she was too much trouble to be truly wanted, burn away to nothing in the light of the barn fire, and she understood all the way through for the first time in her life that she was not less, that she had never been less, that the dark she had been pitied for had been, all along, a country she was queen of, and that she had just carried her strong-sighted husband through it on her hands and knees to safety. "I think," she said, and she was laughing and crying and coughing all at once, "I think, Micah Barlow, I shall never again let anyone tell me what a blind girl cannot do. Not after tonight." "No," Micah agreed, holding her. "No, I don't reckon you will, and God help the fool who tries." Word of that night went through Ember Creek the way fire itself goes, and the town that had watched Wren Ashby shamed in its churchyard now told and retold the tale of how the blind girl led 3 grown people out of a burning house through smoke that blinded strong men, and went back into the flames for the last of them, and the telling of it worked a slow change in that town's hard opinion, as such tellings do. Clarence Fisk found it convenient to have always admired Miss Ashby's pluck. Hester Ashby said less, but was heard once to allow that she'd always known the girl had more in her than folk credited, which was a lie, but a lie in the right direction, which is sometimes the best a hard heart can manage. Wren did not much care what Ember Creek said now, one way or the other. She had a farm on Honey Ridge, and a husband who saw her true, and a great golden dog at her left hand, and, in the fullness of time, children of her own, whom she raised as capably and lovingly as Micah's blind mother had raised her 3 sons, and who grew up thinking nothing at all unusual about a mother who moved through the dark surer than the light, for it was simply how their mother was. And their mother was wonderful, and on winter nights when the snow came down over Honey Ridge and the fire burned warm in the mended house, Micah would sometimes ask Wren to sing, and she would, that high, clear, aching voice filling the firelit room, and Micah would sit and listen with his eyes closed, on purpose, he said, so as to hear it the way she heard everything, whole and undistracted. And he would think how strange and blessed a thing it was that a fool in a churchyard had once said no man would wed a blind girl, and had been more wrong than he could ever know. For Micah Barlow had not settled, nor stooped, nor done a charity when he wed Wren Ashby. He had married the strongest, truest, most clear-sighted soul in the whole valley, who happened to carry her sight in her hands and her ears and her fearless heart instead of her eyes, and who had proven, on the darkest night of both their lives, that the woman the town called blind could see, when it mattered most, a great deal better than any of them. He had said he didn't need eyes. He needed her heart. He had gotten, in the bargain, both, for her heart, it turned out, was the truest pair of eyes in the country, and it never once, all their long lives together, looked at Micah Barlow and saw anything but a man worth loving. And if ever, in the years that followed, some stranger passing through Ember Creek made the mistake of speaking of poor blind Mrs. Barlow up on Honey Ridge, there was always some neighbor near to set them straight, and to tell the tale of the winter fire, and of the woman who saw 3 souls out of the smoke that blinded strong men. And the stranger would go away having learned what the whole valley had learned the hard way, which is that it is a foolish and a dangerous thing to call a person weak for the one difference you can see, when you have never once troubled to learn the whole of what they are.